We spent a lot of time yesterday learning how to add and subtract integers. We used a couple of representations with chips and with number lines in the video, and then in class we explored it a little bit deeper through word problems and things like that. So today what we're going to do, we're going to move into multiplying and dividing integers using some of the same strategies we used before. So we're back to the chips. Bring up the number line in a second. But before we dig into the negatives, let's again, like we did yesterday, let's discuss how what the definition for multiplication is. Remember, the multiplication is just grouping things again and again. So when I have 2 times 3, that means I have a group of 2, and I'm going to add it to itself 3 times. So there's 2 groups of 2, 3 groups of 2. Okay, so I have 3 groups of 2. Obviously, that's 6. Hope you knew that before I actually put the chips on the board. So we're going to kind of use that whole thought of repeatedly putting together groups for when we deal with the negative. So here I have -2 times 3, or if you prefer, we could put the negative on the 3 as well. Doesn't really matter. But I'm going to take my -2, and I'm going to make 3 groups of those. Now think about what we're doing. Here we have -2 plus -2 plus -2. And from yesterday's video, you should see as we continue to add -2 down the line, we're getting more and more negative, because adding a negative and a negative gives me more negative, moves me further to the left. So -2 times 3, that's 3 groups of -2, gives me -6. Very easy to spot when we use the chips here. So if I have a positive times a negative, it's always going to give me a negative if I have different signs, because we're repeatedly adding that negative. I know you might have learned rules like love to hate, hate to love. To me, that always confused me. But when I think about the definition for multiplication, where I repeatedly add the negative, that makes sense. If I add more negatives, I get more negatives. So a positive times a negative is a negative. Now when we go in, what we're going to do next is we're going to add another negative sign. We're going to put it here on the -3. So each factor now is a negative number. Now the problem with this is that how do I have -2 a negative number of times? That's difficult. I can have -2 a positive number of times. Let me just duplicate this here. So I have -2 a positive 3 times. That puts me at -6, as we just saw in the last part of the video. But to do -2 a negative number of times, I have to remember a very important definition we talked about yesterday. And that's kind of how we read this sign right here. How do we read this -3? That's one way to read it. But if you remember, the other way to read that is to say it's the opposite of 3. The opposite of 3. So what I have here is I have -2 times the opposite of 3. Well, what's -2 times 3? That's -6 right here on the number line. So the opposite of that, the opposite of 3, would then bring us all the way over here. What's the opposite of -6? +6. So that's why a negative times a negative is a positive. Okay, because we throw that negative sign on the other factor, and we're saying it's the opposite of that. Okay, a little bit tricky, but just remember that it's because we can read this either the negative as a -3 or the opposite of 3. And for this definition, we think of it as the opposite. So let's talk about division then. Let's look again what division means. Division means obviously putting things into groups. So let me get this. So let's say we have 6 groups. Just get 6, or we have a group of 6. Let me put that on the board here. And how many groups of 3 do we have there? Well, that's easy. You can spot that right now. I have 2 groups of 3. So 6 divided by 3 is 2. Okay? But what if I have a negative number here? What if I have a negative divided by a positive? Or a positive divided by a negative? It doesn't really matter. Well, let's say I have a group of 6, and I divide it into groups of 3. Well, watch what happens. Again, I still have 2 groups, but this time, notice what's inside my groups. I don't have positive numbers inside. Now I have 2 groups of negative numbers. So negative 2. Negative divided by a positive is a negative, just like a negative times a positive is a negative. So if we have different signs, we're going to get a negative number. And that all goes back to the definition of multiplication and division. All right, now we're back to this again. Remember, we can read this one of two ways. We can read this as 6 divided by negative 3 or 6 divided by the opposite of 3. And we saw on the last slide here that negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2, but we're doing negative 6 divided by the opposite of 3. So that moves us all the way over here to positive 2. Straight line there. All right. Okay? Which means a negative divided by a negative is also a positive by that same definition we've been using. So what I want you to do now, I want you to use what you learned yesterday in class with the adding and subtracting. I want you to use what you learned in this video, and there's an integer operations review assignment there. I want you to do those problems, and then tomorrow in class we're gonna take all this stuff we've learned and we're going to apply it to a lot of the things we saw in Chapter 1. We're going to go back to order of operations, only this time we'll throw in some negatives. We're going to go back to distributive property.